We have Luke Harden, who is a senior foreign correspondent of The Guardian and the author of new book that we will be discussing today. Luke is the author of quite a few books, the #1 New York bestselling author of Collusion that I highly recommend. He's been translated to 30 languages, right, Luke? About so. Congratulations, Luke, on your new book. Then we have Andrei Soldatov, who is another writer, author, and a journalist. And Andrei, would you like to say a couple of words? How would you best like to be presented?
I'm a journalist, just a journalist based in Moscow, and I've been writing about the Russian secret services since 1999. And I have 3 books with my co-author Irina Baragan, The New Nobility, The Red Web, and the latest one, The Compatriots.
The Compatriots is wonderful. We are carrying it at Globus, so, and as the other books are available as well, so contact us for that. And we have Yuri Filshtinsky, who is an outstanding Russian historian, has great work that has been very influential during the last few years of the whole Trump-Russia scandal. And Yuri, would you like to say a couple of words about your work?
Well, I'm mainly a historian, first of all, specializing in post-1917 Russia, Soviet Union. My major books are on Russian and Soviet history, but since approximately 91, I became also a person who was writing books about contemporary Russian. The most famous one, unfortunately, because Litvinenko was killed, was the book which I wrote with Litvinenko, Blowing Up Russia. This is about explosions of September 99 in Russia when 300 people were killed. The next one was The Corporation, which is a kind of collective portrait of KGB coming into power. I also wrote a book on Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as the rest of the world, since 2016, I'm deeply involved in studying our President Donald Trump. So, and I publish, several, I would consider serious pieces on Trump and Russia. Unfortunately, I guess we still didn't pay attention to this. Otherwise, he will not be in the White House.
Well, thank you, Yuri. We have Brian Friedenberg, who is also a journalist and did some early research on Gazprom. Why don't you say a few words about your work?
As an American, watching the news coverage when those emails were leaked during the Democratic Convention in July, and I remember vaguely earlier hearing, oh, Russia had hacked some stuff and then nothing else. And I was just like, why are we talking about so much of the content of these emails, which is fairly innocuous, and not giving the context of the fact that a foreign power hacked one of our 2 parties and deliberately timed this to do damage to one of our 2 parties, and I wasn't getting the answers I wanted from my own news media coverage and from international news media coverage, and I had a background in Russian history and had been writing for years, so I kind of knew about these sort of war by other means, hybrid measures, active measures, approaches of the Russians, and it just looked really bad. And so I did my own explorations, and I beat a lot of the regular, and I'm sure you guys all have this experience too, where you had material and you were knocking on the doors of all these different outlets, and obviously in 2016 they weren't paying attention to it. So I echo that sentiment.
Daniel, would you like to speak a little bit about your work as well?
Sure. My name is Dan Malmer, and I'm a software developer, and I have a long-time interest in digital identity. And so about 5 years ago, I started looking into social media manipulation. And I would use textual analysis to identify inauthentic behavior on social media networks. At that point, it was mostly Facebook. I've moved on to Twitter because it's easier to access data, and just founded a nonprofit called the Center for the Study of Internet Extremism. And I'm looking at connections and ways that people get radicalized on Twitter.
Thank you, Daniel. Maybe I should say a couple of words about myself because
yeah, you've done some great work too. So
well, I don't know about that. Like I mentioned before, I don't consider myself a journalist. Really, I'm a journalist from desperation, really, because I'm a writer. But I happened to grow up in Russia and spend quite a bit of my life there during the 90s. And as you know, the 90s were this wild period in Russia where a lot of things were happening. And as the things started to unravel with Trump coming to power, I've noticed certain similarities to the patterns I've observed there as I was a translator. And so my life experience kind of led me to my research. But Luke mentions it in his book, and the swallow phenomenon when the young girls were hired to work for KGB kind of brushed on me because the KGB officer once tried to hire me to be such a swallow. Oh, you didn't know, Luke? Yeah. Well, yeah, I didn't do it, and I do not regret it. But from the journalistic point of view, so it didn't happen, but I know that it was happening. And I was translating at some pretty high up negotiations in Moscow and around the Soviet Union. And I was translating for people who are now pretty high up, who were at the time offering bribes to the Western businessmen and politicians, successfully so. So I've seen it happening, and so I followed the line from this empirical kind of knowledge, and so hence my research that one can find on the Byline Times and Medium. So I have a lot of interest in this panel. I read all of you guys' work and admire it, and I can't wait for Luke to speak about the new book. I'm a big fan of Collusion. So my first question then for you, Luke, what is the difference between this book, by the way, here it is, Shadow State, and the Collusion? For the readers of Collusion, why would you say they should read this book?
Yeah, I mean, the strange thing is that actually one reviewer who reviewed Shadow State this week said it was the third in a trilogy, and I hadn't actually thought about it like that, but there's something in that, because the previous two books before Collusion was A Very Expensive Poison, about the murder of Yuri's friend, Alexander Litvinenko, in 2006, and what we now know was basically a Kremlin murder operation involving a radioactive cup of tea. And I wrote a big book about that somewhat late in the day, but after the British public inquiry, which revealed all of the kind of police and scientific evidence, which made it absolutely clear that this was a kind of extraordinary kind of Russian state plot. So that was one extraordinary event of several that we've seen in recent years, and I would include what happened in Georgia, and also, of course, the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine in 2014. And then of course, the next installment was 2016, which I write about Collusion and the major multi-level espionage operation to help Donald Trump win the White House, which actually I don't think Putin believed would happen. I'm not even sure Donald Trump believed it would happen, but there was a huge effort involved. We now know, thanks to the work of my colleagues, thanks to some extent to Robert Mueller and his report, which came out last year, that there was indeed a sweeping and systematic effort. And I wrote that book in a hurry. I mean, it was a quickly done book in 2017, because I sort of felt that the Russian dimension, particularly Trump's visits to Soviet Moscow in 1987 and so on, were not understood. It was not understood that he would be bugged, like any high-profile American, and that the KGB would try and exploit and instrumentalize him. And, you know, I would have stopped were it not for the fact that our kind of reality is just so surreal and sometimes grotesque. And since Collusion happened, I think there were two major developments. One was in the UK, once again, we had the attempted murder using Novichok, nerve agent of Sergei Skripal, a former GRU officer who, as we know, was swapped in 2010, settled in the UK. And the book opens with two killers boarding a flight from Moscow, cover names Petrov and Bashir, real names Chapiga and Mishkin, flying into London to kill him, using a kind of weapon that's not been seen on European territory since the Second World War. quite an astonishing, brazen thing. So I wanted to tell that story, but also I wanted to tell the story of Brexit, because in the US at least, you have had Mueller. Now I have problems with Mueller, but there was a sort of sincere attempt or semi-attempt to interrogate the events in America of 2016. And in London, where I am, there was a similar espionage operation that took place 4 years ago, same time as Brexit. I mean, I write in the book that there were two plays, two dramas, and these overlapped with sometimes the same characters, the same people. So often the location was Europe as well as the US. And in both narrowly contested elections, the Trump one and the Brexit vote, there was a huge push by Russian operatives to help this happen. So I wanted to tell that story. And I also wanted to write about Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Russian oligarch, whose story, out Dostoevsky's Dostoevsky, out Gogol's Gogol. I mean, this is a guy who was a hoodlum in the 1980s. He used to mug women for their fur coats, spent 8 years in Soviet jail, got out at a time when everyone was stealing again, went into hot dogs, was flipping hot dogs, moved very quickly up through the kind of criminal St. Petersburg underworld, became friends with Vladimir Putin, became caterer to Putin, then to the whole of Russia, acquired a mercenary army, and started a troll farm which sabotaged an American election. I mean, you don't need fiction. I mean, reality is just, it's off the wall, and yet this is all true. And so my book is another non-fiction thriller which tries to encapsulate our crazy times, contextualize it, and just explain what Vladimir Putin is doing, which is essentially to try and sabotage and wreck Western democracy, not by being a super genius, but because he isn't, but by identifying, sniffing out, exploiting weaknesses in Western society and seeing what he can do to create chaos. He's a king of chaos, if you like, a little king of chaos. And his project is going quite well, I would say, at the moment.
That's probably why I love reading your book so much, because you write them with Dostoevsky and Gogol in mind, because there's a little bit of the inspector by Gogol, a little bit of the demons. You find all of it there, and it's happening now in real time. And it's, as probably all the fellow journalists know, it's so hard to put it all together, all the layers and all the possible planes. How do they all convene? It's like a novel, but the novel of a Dostoevsky scale, really. And so yeah,
I was just going to say, and actually when I write, I sort of try and write it kind of filmically and descriptively, and actually a lot of my books have been turned into films and plays. I mean, the Litvinenko story, which Yuri, of course, is in and has told himself, and I'm sure we'll talk about, was staged as a play before lockdown at the Old Vic Theatre in London. It was a huge hit. I mean, it was sold out and so on. And actually, you think about it, there's a sort of theatrical, dramaturgical aspect to what the Kremlin is doing, both domestically with its own population. When it loses popularity, they have to come up with some new storyline. So the storyline, of 2014 was Crimea and Ukraine, and Crimea is ours. And then aboard of that, and so it's Syria. We're defeating terrorism in Syria, and they're sort of running out of plot lines. But if you look at the Skripal case, it is Gogolian insofar as, I described the Skripal killers, Mishkin and Chapiga, and the GRU generally, with these operations that have been in the news this week in America, this bounty paid allegedly to the Taliban to kill American soldiers. It's the same secret GRU murder unit that's been hiding out in Western Europe for the past few years, doing operations, including the Salisbury hit. But it's, I say in the book, it's like a lethal and dopey golem. It's like a sort of giant, stupid monster that goes down the street, and you sort of think it's funny until this golem takes its fist and smashes your roof in. And there is a kind of darkly comic aspect, but also at the end of the day, it's deeply sinister. These are murderous people, and what Putin is doing is following a sort of Soviet playbook, updated, for the 21st century, and there's a sort of cold ruthlessness about it, which makes it very effective when he's dealing with Western democratic politicians who even now are struggling to process what's really going on.
Yeah, and that ties into my second question right in, the whole theatrical part of it, and the whole staged part is actually a part of what Gerasimov called information doctrine, and the part of the whole information warfare. And I, again, had an early exposure to it because in the university that I attended, I had to take a class on the combat propaganda. So they were actually teaching people who were experts, say, in English language or literature, to apply these theatrical moves, how to stage these things. And I know that you talk in your book about the whole Gerasimov doctrine, information warfare. Could you comment on that? And also a little bit on maybe RT, former known as Russia Today, and Sputnik, and other state-sponsored media agencies.
Yeah. I mean, on Andrei Soldatov, I'm sure he'll talk about this. I mean, he's written brilliantly about this. I mean, I'm a huge fan of The Red Web. His not his latest book, but the one before that, which better than anything I've read lays out all this. But I mean, I think, a couple of big points. I mean, one is that the US sort of invented. The US is the kind of foremost tech power, web power. I mean, we're on Zoom, right? And and we use Facebook and we use Twitter, and yet, these are the vectors through which the GRU, sitting in a sort of central building in Moscow in a tower in Khimki, managed to mess with the heads of American voters and sort of wreck or semi-wreck the election of 2016. And it's interesting. And I quote Andre in the book about basically the Russia kind of caught up and realized that the very porousness, the open nature of Western society, the fact that anybody can speak or contribute or write, makes it terribly vulnerable to targeted attacks by unscrupulous authoritarian players. I mean, Russia first and foremost, but also the Chinese and maybe the Syrians and possibly the Turks and any aspiring power. And this is a kind of huge problem. And I think America was asleep really in 2016. And Gerasimov, I mean, I get the impression he's slightly overhyped. I mean, the Gerasimov doctrine seems to me rather an old one rather than a new one. But what is undoubtedly true is that the kind of things that Collusion, for example, Oleg Collusion, whom Yuri interviewed and knows well, and whom I also quote via Yuri, the kind of things, operations he was doing in the 70s and 80s to try and destabilize America, they never got much traction. I mean, the KGB was doing forgeries. They were sending letters, typing letters, and pretending to be American racists and this kind of thing. And that's great, but not much impact. And now we have a few guys in a tower who can reach millions of Americans. And it's psychological warfare. And just on your other point about RT, I'm not a fan of RT, it may surprise you to learn. They have a lot of very crazy people on in the UK. I think it's part of a kind of more sinister sort of matrix, which is the idea that in our noisy, cacophonous times, there is no such thing as truth. There are just rival narratives. And this is something that the Putin regime has been pushing for years. MH17 is blown out of the sky in Ukraine, and there are immediately sort of 20 conspiracy theories pumped out on the internet. And the idea isn't necessarily to convince you, it's to kind of, it's to make the idea, it's epistemological, it's to make the idea of truth difficult, problematic, unknowable. And one of the reasons I write my books is because I believe in the truth, a kind of unitary truth. And I want to kind of tell a real story, a true story, and to sort of reassert Enlightenment values of transparency and clarity and factuality in a time of, feels to me like darkness, or almost darkness.
Thank you, Luke, because this information that you put in together in the book, again, this is the book, read the book, ties together all these puzzle pieces. And that again ties into my last question. And today, as some of us know, is a very special and sad day in Russia. Because as the early results of the referendum coming in, we are seeing that Putin has basically cemented his presidential tenure till 2036. Plus, there are other amendments to the constitution that, you know, one can argue would be detrimental to the Russian Federation. So my question is, what is the significance of your book today to your readers in the West? Because it's kind of clear to some of us what it means to people in Russia, but the readers, the audience in the West doesn't always tie up these political changes in the Russian Federation to the UK or to the US. And I understand that's what you do in your book, and that concerns both Brexit and Trump's presidency. Could you please comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, firstly, just on the referendum. I mean, it's not a great surprise, is it? What the result is going to be, and it's sort of pseudo politics. It's not a real vote. It's not a competitive vote, and it's Potemkin. I mean, as is every kind of vote in Russia in kind of recent years. But in terms of my book, I mean, I think my book is supposed to be, as well as being a kind of thriller, a non-fiction thriller, it's supposed to be a wake-up call, actually, to people in the West to realize what's going on. And it doesn't say Vladimir Putin is all powerful. I mean, he isn't, but it does say, as I mentioned before, that he's a very skillful opportunist. And I think we've seen this kind of sequence of events over the last 2 decades, beginning with Yukos and the breakup of Mikhail Khodorkovsky's oil firm, which was stolen by the state, and he was tossed into jail. It was kind of a message that actually the state could take private property away if it wished to, and then threading through the Litvinenko poisoning, the Georgia and Ukraine, election interference, and so on, is that what Russia has become under Vladimir Putin will remain if he stays in power until 2036 is a rogue state. Actually, it's a rogue state that is domestically repressive. Russians know that better than anybody, and internationally aggressive and revisionist. And the problem thus far has been the political response. I mean, if we just park Trump for one moment, from successive British governments to what happened to Litvinenko and Skripal, it's generally been rather weak. It's been conventional. It's been a few diplomats thrown out. It's been words of protest, diplomatic communiques. Putin doesn't care about any of that at all. I mean, it doesn't bother him. And so the regime keeps doubling down. I mean, it's stolen a territory the size of Belgium, and it's got away with it. We've all kind of forgotten about Crimea, practically. Started the war in eastern Ukraine where 10,000 people have died. You know, I reported for The Guardian from Georgia and chased in my rubbish car Russian tanks as they were heading towards Tbilisi. I mean, eventually they turned left. They didn't get as far as Tbilisi, but no one knew how far they were going. And this behavior will continue. And so I think it's a very bad day for ordinary Russians who want democracy and who don't want this kind of corrupt propaganda model they get at the moment. But also it's bad for my country, for the UK. This aggressive vector will continue. And just one last thing, if my broadband holds up, which is, you know, there are smart things that the West can do. In London, in particular, in my town, you have to bear in mind that these people who sit in Moscow and claim to be super patriots and they love Putin and all the rest of it, as Yuri and Andrei know perfectly well, very often their families live abroad, their kids, and all of their money is offshore. it's in Swiss banks, it's in the city of London, it's in Guernsey, Jersey. When I did the Panama Papers for The Guardian, big investigation 4 years ago, I was amazed at who I found. I found Alisha Usmanov's offshore companies. I found Dmitry Peskov's wife, Tatiana Navka, the whole Russian elite. Actually, all of their money wasn't in Russia, it was in the West. And so when these outrages happen, the answer is not to kick out diplomats. The answer is to go after the money and to expose bank accounts, to stop travel, to ban a whole load of people at the top of the Russian elite. That would be very painful. But the problem where I sit is that Boris Johnson's got no desire to do this because we've got Brexit, we've got problems, and I think he welcomes all of this sort of cash from Russia. But we need sort of basically more political will, I think. But we also need people to kind of write books and to read books which set this out in a compelling way that I hope everybody can understand and maybe enjoy as well.
Yeah, I can't agree more, and that's why I run a bookstore. So I have the book, we have other books by Luke Hardin and Andrei Soldatov. We will get other books by Yuri Filshtinsky, but you know, we will have a good collection on the subject. Come talk to us, will help. So Luke, would there be anything else that I'm sure there's a lot that you want to say, but what's important? And
I just wondered if Andre, you're in Moscow, right? Whether if you might just update us with what happened today, what the latest news is, how you would answer that question about what this means for Russia going forward.
Well, it's really very sad there for Moscow because well, the result was predicted, and we don't see huge crowds of Moscovites protesting as we used to see in 2011, 2012. So it looks like right now there is no hope, and people are really desperate, and the feeling of despair is palpable. You can see that, and because it looks like even the Russian opposition doesn't know what to do about this constitution and amendments to the constitution. There is no plan, there is no idea for the future. But at the same time, I think that it's actually a very interesting moment for all of us. And now I'm talking not only about Russia, but about everybody, because Putin's actions actually is about concerns so many countries now. The very first time in Putin's personal history in the Kremlin, he got really, really nervous. We don't know yet why he decided to have this voting now. Why not to delay it, for instance, until September, maybe in November? Because there is no rush. There is no logic. Why to do these things? And it looks like this spring, Putin started making mistakes. We all got used to think of him that he's a tactical genius. He was tactically genius in Ukraine. He was great in Syria. He outsmarted all European leaders. He outsmarted Trump. But it looks like now something is changing. He made this huge mistake going into war, oil war with Saudi Arabia. And the oil prices are really not very impressive. He got the loss of his popularity, and now it's not 60%, it might be 40%, maybe even lower. We got not very impressive, I would say, performance of Putin during the crisis with COVID. Sobyanin, the Moscow mayor, was much more present, active, he was doing things. He was even supported by the Russian opposition, which was really strange to me. Putin was nowhere. He was hiding in his bunker for months. And then he decided to have this crazy military parade just 2 days after the Second World War started for Russia. It started for Russia on June 22, and Putin decided to have a military parade celebrating on the victory on June 24, so what's the point? Immediately all of us got confused. For instance, the Russian patriarch actually congratulated everybody on June 22 with the start of the war. I mean, how you can, it's such a crazy thing. People got, died in the millions, and we got a congratulation from the Russian patriarch. And I think it betrays a climate of confusion and uncertainty. It's really difficult to say why. I do not quite understand why Putin became so nervous. And we do not know, of course, it's really difficult to guess. We could only guess what's going on in the Kremlin. But I just wanted to stress that on the surface, it looks very sad, as happened. Actually, it's normal for Russia to look sad. But maybe something started changing. And my personal impression that this plan to make Russia another Central Asian state couldn't work and would not work, and we could see some interesting developments pretty soon.
Interesting. Could I ask Yuri the same question?
The same question.
Well, I mean, what do you think will happen? Whether you think there may be change, as Andre suggests, or whether you think we are going to have a 20 years of Putin?
Yeah. Look, I think I'm more skeptical than Andre. I do think that nothing is going to change in Russia for some time, whether this would be 2024 or 2036. Sooner or later, whatever, if everybody else, Putin will die or will go, then we probably will see some changes. I do not think anything would change unless Putin starts a major conflict. This was always my position in 2014 when they invaded Crimea and Ukraine, that it was not clear whether this would be the end of the story or the beginning of the story. I think they had plans in 2014 to proceed further to Ukraine, to proceed to the Baltic states. I think that's when they tested water. And for some reasons, we do not know why, they decided not to proceed with invasion. I think the reason they decided not to proceed with invasion because it was clear in 2014 that if they cross the border into the Baltic states, NATO is going to intervene. Russia invades today. Trump will not get American troops involved. And this is not surprising for me at all, because I am considering Trump being Putin agents, literally, in literal terms, not in philosophical terms. So I do not believe that Trump would declare war against Putin if Putin invades the Baltic states. I think this is a great danger. But so I'm very, very skeptical. I do not think that anything will be changing in Russia for better or for worse until Putin is there. Except, once again, I'm afraid that there might be some plans in Kremlin to invade, because they do understand greatness in a very physical way. They would like to extend the borders of the Russian Federation. So, but in this connection, my question to you was, which I was planning to ask, and I'm doing this now. What is the end game? You know, as a historian, you know, in 1917, we know that Bolsheviks came to power in Russia, and the end game was the World Revolution. I mean, it was a very theoretical program, partially naive, partially too optimistic, but at least we know what the end game was, the World Revolution. What is the end game for Putin?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think there are sort of two aspects to this. I mean, in historical terms, it seems pretty clear to me that Putin, whether he invades the Baltics or not, his primary goal is to make Russia great again, to coin a slogan, is to make it the superpower it once was or thought it was in Soviet times. And it's a kind of great powerism, whether you think it's 19th century great powerism or 20th century great powerism. And it's for Russia to be a kind of maximal player on the world stage, and a country or an imperium whose opinion is sought, that no conflict, whether it's in the Middle East or it's Iran or Ukraine or Europe or whatever, can be resolved without Russia's say so. And this has been explored in sort of diplomatic pseudo phrases like multipolarity. You remember Putin's famous Munich speech 40 years ago, where he attacked the idea of a unipolar American-dominated world and talked about multipolarity. And more recently, last few years, it's had a distinctly kind of fascist tinge. The writings of Alexander Dugin, who's become this kind of national celebrity philosopher, and the whole idea of Eurasianism and so on. And I don't think there's much ideology behind it, to be honest. I don't think Putin actually reads Dugin late at night. I think it's this kind of KGB instinct for domination. It's the idea that, as you say, that it's all about force and projection of power. There's no subtlety involved. It's just force solutions all the time. And it's about sort of dominating the near abroad, the former Soviet republics, which Putin regards as sub-sovereign. I don't think he really thinks that Ukraine is a real place, a real kind of sovereign entity, and so that's his goal. And I think he also I mean, it's hard to know with Putin. In a way, you don't really want to be inside his head, but there's a messianic dimension to it as well. I think he genuinely thinks that he is put there by God or by fate or whatever to lead Russia back to greatness, and that's what he intends to do. But I mean, that's like the front of the shop is this great power project, but the back of the shop, everybody is stealing all of the clothes and the merchandise. And actually, there's the patriotic project, but there's also the sort of furtive, secret, shabby private project, which is to steal as much money from Russia as you can, to offshore it for you, for your wife, for your mistresses, for your family, and to protect it from predatory attack by other people inside the Russian elite. And what really keeps these people up at night, I think, is not dreams of imperial or near imperial greatness. It's how do I hang on to my $500 million? And how do I, keep playing the Kremlin game so I don't fall out of favor, like so many oligarchs have done, and end up in the West, and their fortunes go from 500 million or a billion or 2 billion. They find themselves down to their last $80 million in exile. I mean, how humiliating. And so the private project is actually more important than the public project. So the kleptocracy is more important than the imperium, to my mind. But both are running simultaneously. But you only basically talk about the imperium. You don't mention the fact that Putin, I would say, is the richest person not only in the world but in human history. And not that he has this money in his bank account, but he can basically instrumentalize and deploy all of the resources of the state. Everything belongs to him. It's his in some level. So it's fascinating, it's dysfunctional, and it's not very good for the rest of the world.
I really agree. And again, psychology is such a great part to it, and you touch upon it. You are trying to explain to the Western readers how the Russian mind works, or how the Russian mentality works. And of course, it's not a homogeneous thing. There are different Russian mentalities, and we're talking about very particular type of people. And it's important here to remember that they came from a very poor background. They came from a place where they had nothing. And I think you touch upon this in the book very well, and it explains the whole phenomena of kleptocracy very well as well.
I just wonder if Daniel should say something quickly, because Daniel hasn't had a shot yet.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I want to say that I strongly agree with, you mentioned truth and erosion of truth. And one of the things that I study is the overlap between propaganda and extremism and conspiracy theories. And one of the things and there's a lot of overlap there between these three things. And one of the problems with conspiracy theories is that once you believe in one untruth or unreality, it's very easy to believe in other unrealities. And so that's been one of the attacks on our democracy, is this erosion of an objective view of truth and reality. Another thing so the way that technology plays into this is it's very easy now to spread conspiracy theories. About 40 years ago, Russia was able to launch a campaign called Operation Infection, where they got people to believe that the CIA had somehow unleashed the HIV virus. And the way they did it was by planting that story first in some cutout newspaper in India, and eventually it got picked up by more and more credible sources. It took them a long time, several years, to get that to happen. Now you can get things like that to take off in a few hours on things like Twitter and Facebook. The other thing that these social media networks provide is social support for people who want to stop believing in these conspiracy theories. So you can see online right now, you can see people who are believers in conspiracy theories like QAnon, for example, and you can see them trying to leave that movement or that community, and other members of that community support their beliefs and pull them back in. So these are some of the ways that technology today is contributing to attacks on our democracy through the erosion of truth.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel.
A couple of quick points popped to me. I was wondering if I could just respond briefly to what Luke was saying. Well, just I couldn't agree more. Like, real briefly on the objectivity aspect, I feel like that's something that we all share, and that the best journalists share. And part of the reason that this propaganda on the part of the Kremlin has been so effective is that when you look at both far-right media and far-left media, they too subscribe to this idea that, you know, truth is always in the eye of the beholder, and the U.S. is just as bad as anybody else because we did such and such in Central America back in the day. And I'm not justifying or excusing that, but it's always this whataboutism. And if you look at particularly, say, The Intercept or Glenn Greenwald covers anything, it's like, yeah, well, America did this before, so who are we to complain about this Russian interference? And by the way, it's not that bad anyway. And so you get a lot of willing, you know the term, useful idiots on the media on the right and the left that amplify this, and they're only too eager to do so. And they don't even need encouragement from the Kremlin. They just do it on their own. As far as the theatricality, I couldn't agree more. And it's funny because I titled my ebook on the whole Ukraine saga and how it fits into the larger Trump-Russia saga, A Song of Gas and Politics. And I kind of mirrored it narratively off of Game of Thrones, where you have these like two different continents, and there's all these activities and all these people and all these storylines that happen, and then they end up coming together for a real big crazy finale. And that's essentially what happened when you look at Donald Trump's ties to the Russian mafia in the US and what was going on in Ukraine and other operations over in Europe. And lastly, in terms of just the whole idea of there being these separate campaigns, Brexit's certainly one of them, also the United States, but the war is really against Western democracy and spreading democracy anywhere. And that's why Putin is so intent on shutting down the Syrian revolution. And that's why he's got Prigozhin, who you were just talking about, Putin's chef. He's running that in some ways, and he's running the information operations in the US. And so you can literally tie the US and Syria directly into this overall war. And it's Ukraine, it's the Catalan independence movement, it's that shady stuff that went on in Austria, it's the meddling with the Five-Star movement in Italy, it's the Scottish independence movement that they're supporting as well. I mean, they're just trying to do whatever they can to destabilize Western democracy, and it really is this massive theatrical, literary, dramatic campaign. And what's so hard is that there's all these moving parts, and the Western media is so bad at this point, at least in the US, at looking at anything where there's complication or more than one moving part. They focus on one thing here, one thing there. And my analogy I made with their coverage of Trump-Russia is they took puzzle pieces and they threw it in the face of the public, and that kept bouncing off of our faces and falling to the ground. And we were supposed to look at the ground and see a big picture that the media never bothered to put together. And that's what your book obviously does, and your trilogy, I should say. And so we're really grateful that you were able to get that information out. And you guys are also all working on this. So that's, but it's just so rare to find people to understand this like we do. And it's really sad that so few people realize this massive campaign that's being conducted against us.
Well, thank you, Brian. And I think this is a very valid point. I think it's a great discussion, and we're touching upon so many aspects of what's happening now in the whole entire world, with Russia in the middle of it and the focus as a focus point. So thank you, everyone. So I know I already have a question that came to us from Facebook, so I'm just gonna. So how does this play out on the Pakistan, India, Afghanistan playing field? I know about the India fake news network, but the story could go way back to some of the events, such, for example, as the rise of Hindutva. Would you answer that?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I think it's a slightly parallel conversation to what we're talking about today. I mean, I can have a shot at it because I was the Guardian's South Asia correspondent, and I lived in Delhi between 2000 and 2003 and covered the war in Afghanistan. And Hindutva is basically the rise of radical Hindu nationalism, which has got bigger and bigger and bigger, and kind of metastasized into Narendra Modi, who's the current prime minister, and who is very much in the kind of Trump, Putin, Erdogan mold. I mean, all I would say is that there are similarities between radical right-wing populist nationalist movements all around the world. I mean, you can see Duterte in the Philippines, it's the same. And it's this toxic mixture of denigrating the media, the profession that we all work in to some degree as journalists, casting us as kind of enemies, of sort of relentless propaganda, and of lying. And I'm not so sure to what degree Modi actually lies, but I'm certainly, what I'm very disconcerted by is that what Donald Trump is doing in terms of lying, or Vladimir Putin is doing, which is to lie all the time. I mean, Putin at least learned how to do it semi-convincingly. I mean, he was taught seminars in lying, I think, at Leningrad spy school. And he does it with a straight face. He uses diplomatic language. No, we didn't intervene in the election. We don't meddle in American affairs, etc., etc. But what's so depressing is the way this is spreading, because our wonderful Prime Minister Boris Johnson also lies, actually a lot, in a way that no previous Prime Minister has done. And I think it's a kind of very worrying trend. It affects South Asia, it affects everywhere. And in a way, we as writers and journalists, we have to try and fight against that. And as we said earlier, tell the truth, or narrate the truth.
There are a couple more questions, like on a lighter note, and I'll go for one of them. Have you met Putin in person?
That's a great question. Well, sort of is the answer. I used to go to the Kremlin's press conferences. I don't know if Andrei or Yuri ever went to those. I'm sure Andrei's been. And they were just ridiculous. It was in the Kremlin hall. He's on the stage, and he would do, it was a macho exercise. He'd do about 4 or 5 hours press conference. You couldn't get out and go for a pee. And it was pointless. I mean, I wanted to ask questions about, I had my hand up for about 2 hours, and of course I was never going to be picked, because when I was in Moscow, I was kind of marked down as a kind of enemy pretty early on. I've been to his dacha a couple of times for press events. That's also not very satisfactory, because Putin is always late. I mean, he kept the British Queen waiting, for goodness sake. I mean, and I think he kept us waiting about 6 hours on one occasion. I mean, you lose the will to live when he appears. I've never shaken his hand. I've sat across a very big table from him. And he's remarkably short. He's tiny. And the whole Russian government is a government of very small men. Actually, I mean, if Andrei and Yuri want to disagree with me, they're very welcome.
No, there's a couple of You're absolutely right.
True. They're very, very small men. And Dmitry Medvedev he's the smallest world leader I've ever seen, if you can call him that, when he was president. I mean, you could practically put him in a cup. I mean, he's so tiny. And I guess that's a kind of trivial point. But he's both underwhelming and kind of overwhelming, because the occasion is such a big one and there's a sort of frisson about it. But
I just want to say that I have never, thank God, met Putin in person, and that sure enough, you know, the majority of shorter stature people are completely capable and not turning to be the dictators. But in this particular case, it's an interesting detail, because as some of us know, on the television in the 90s, there was a show called Kukli, where he was impersonated by a puppet from a Hoffman fairy tale. And Putin got so angry that the whole show and eventually the whole channel was banned, and the people who owned the station had to flee Russia. That is how sensitive he is, and that's an interesting feature in character, you know, to the character.
Zarina, don't get me wrong, I'm not being shortest. I love short people. My wife is very short.
Maybe I can ask a question, if it's possible. Look, I wanted to ask you about one thing. You did a book about the FSB activities in the UK, and you faced them in Moscow, and it was quite ugly for you and your family. And your book of Collusion is mostly about, not mostly, but it's also about the Russian military intelligence. And the new book is mostly about the Russian military intelligence.
Yeah.
And I was always wondering, how do you see the difference between these two agencies? And it's quite interesting, because the FSB was always considered to be kind of political police, and GRU military intelligence. But in the end of the day, we see them both used by Putin and launched against the West. So I'm just interested in your point of view. How do you see the modus operandi in comparison?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Andrei, you're an absolute, probably the foremost expert on kind of elite studies and the kind of intra-agency rivalry. I mean, I think what's interesting is the way the GRU has become better known, mostly after what happened in Nepal. And it's quite interesting, having done the book about Litvinenko, Yuri's friend, that was a sort of FSB plot, basically, with these two rather idiotic killers. One of them, Dmitry Koftin, I've met both of them. I mean, met Dmitry Koftin, who really, I mean, is what can I say? I mean, he used to be a waiter in an Italian restaurant in Germany, and frankly, that was the height of his ability. Lugovoy is kind of more functional and brighter, a little bit brighter, but both awful, soulless sort of characters who were asked, paid, coerced by the FSB to do this. But I think, you know, the GRU really are now very well known in a way they didn't used to be. And certainly for Shadow State, the person I kind of talked to help me make sense of recent events of the last few years was Viktor Tsavorite, who, so far as I know, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, I think he's the only GRU defector who will talk publicly about his old organization. I mean, he was someone who was a star GRU officer, defected in 1978, lives pretty anonymously in the UK. I don't know precisely where he is, but I've met him on several occasions. And he was very interesting, and I sort of quote him in the book, and he basically says that when he worked for the GRU, it was highly professional. It was elite. You had to be very clever, multilingual, talented to actually join it. Unlike the KGB, which was a bit more kind of corrupt, sons of KGB officers would themselves become KGB. And he said the GRU was always in the shadows, and the KGB, with its building in Lubyanka, was far more high profile and obviously involved in domestic repression. I just think the GRU in recent years has got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm not sure whether it's overreached itself or not. But one thing you can say for sure is that its recruits these days are not the posh, clever, urbane Soviet diplomats of the 1960s. I'm thinking of, was it Ivanov, who had an affair with Christine Keeler, caused the war minister in the UK to resign, John Profumo, what was hospitable, played cards, had read literature. And then we fast forward and we have Petrov and Bashirov. And really their interview with Russia Today with RT after the Skripal thing, where they claim to be vitamin salesmen from Switzerland going on a sightseeing trip to Salisbury. I mean, what happened, guys? I'm in a real degradation. And this is Tsavorite's point. And Tsavorite says that actually the degradation in sort of spy institutions is part of a wider illness or malaise that has afflicted all of Russia, whether it's education, whether it's politics, whether it's universities or publishing papers. It's all kind of on a kind of downward descent. And he's very pessimistic about it. So, I mean, just to wrap that up, I mean the GRU is now famous. It's still lethal, as we talked about before, but it's not very competent. And Bellingcat, the open source investigative group, have done some incredible work in the last couple of years. They've done more damage to the GRU in the last 2 years, I would say, than probably CIA and MI6 did throughout the Cold War. They've exposed thousands of agents. They've made the GRU look ridiculous. And I think the game has changed. It's at the moment the GRU is doing analog stuff in a digital world, and it sort of works, but it doesn't work. Ray, have you got any final thoughts?
Well, I totally agree with you about the degradation of military intelligence. But what struck me and what I think is really dangerous is that military intelligence always operate pretending to be at war. That's their modus operandi. They love to actually to do things when they are already at war. And the problem now that it looks like we are going into this direction, and we all accept this notion that we are at some sort of war, if not real war, but information war, cyber war, and immediately everything changing. Because when you are at war, well, you don't need to be supple, you don't need to be very competent, you just need to be effective. If you ask to kill people, you need to kill people, no matter what. And I think that makes them so dangerous, because at war you don't count any well, you don't think about consequences. And I think it's a very big thing about the late period of Putin now. He don't think about consequences of his actions, especially after 2014. It seems to be such an overwhelming thing. Even with Litvinenko, they tried to pretend that they had some proxies. They tried to pretend that these people, they had nothing to do with Russian intelligence and so on and so forth. So at least they're pretending. But now they just decided to go on and do things like we are at real war. And I think that's the most dangerous thing which ever happened actually under Putin.
You agree? Do you agree?
Speaking about war, I think it is very important to understand that they conduct the war and they do consider themselves to be in a war. But I think what also is very important is that they are trying to organize a civil war within a country. Because that's how they won in 1917, 1919 in Russia, to split in population and having a civil war between reds and whites. That's what they were trying to do in Ukraine in 2014, splitting population and having a war between pro-Western Ukraine and pro-Eastern Ukraine. That's what they're trying, ironically, but that's what they're trying to do in the United States. splitting population between Democrats and Republicans, whites and blacks, rich and poor, because that's how you win. You cannot be Trump and win the entire United States, not even being a member of Republican Party some years ago. You have to split, and that's where I guess their power is. They're finding that best place to split population. They succeeded it with Trump, I think, from Kremlin, not from Trump's people, that you first split the Republican Party between those who will support Trump and those who will not. Then you take control of the entire Republican Party. Then you make yourself president. Then you start to control Republican Party, because now a Republican Senate understands that they're going to lose everything if they lose November 3 election. They do the same in Europe. They support right-wing parties, as we see. Every major election in Europe now has certain influence of Russian special forces and Russian propaganda. Somewhere they are successful, somewhere they are not. In some cases, we just do not really know that they were involved, because we do not pay too much attention to those particular small cases or small countries. But I think we are in a very dangerous situation. I think it's more dangerous than it was under Soviet years, because those days they had certain rules. Now it seems to be that they do not have any rules, because from their experience they know that there is no punishment. I mean, whatever they do, starting with Litvinenko case, continues through Ukraine, continues through Skripal case, there is no punishment. They basically are allowed to do as much as they are able to do.
I have two things to say, and one is that I agree with Yuri about Putin's strategy for dividing people along certain lines. What I've seen online is they'll pick any topic. They don't really care as long as there's two sides to it. And so that includes pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine, pro-gun, anti-gun. And you can be sure that Putin is behind the current debate in the US, or is at least stoking the fires when it comes to whether or not to wear a mask in public. Certainly, I haven't seen evidence to that effect, but I'm 100% certain that they're contributing in some way. The second thing I'll say is to thank you, Luke, for the work that you're doing. It's very important, because I think that the majority of Americans certainly are unaware of the nature of Putin. One of the propaganda messages that Russia has been pushing in the US is that Russia is nothing to worry about. They're weak. They can't possibly harm other countries and things like that. I was just reading today about someone who is in college right now, who just learned in college about 9/11. So someone who doesn't know about something that happened less than 20 years ago certainly isn't going to know about the Cold War, for example. So, I think that that's very important. So, and that's I'll conclude with that.
Thank you. Well, first, I want to thank all of you for what you're doing, because this is really so important, and it's nothing less, not to be dramatic, but then the survival of Western democracy being at stake here. And, to my Russian counterparts in particular, you guys are under more risk than the rest of us. So really, it's brave what you're doing. What terrifies me is we're right to point out the amateur, almost clownish quality of the people involved in the Skripal assassination attempt. Maria Butina, Guccifer, if you go back to the 2016 hacking situation, when you look at the digital signature and other evidence, it was so obvious that it was Russians masquerading as people trying to say they weren't Russians. And you can go on, and the fact that these almost amateurish tactics have been so unbelievably effective, to the point that you can make a very good case that Russia was the instrumental tipping point factor that destabilized the United States in a way it has not been destabilized since at least 1968 and possibly the Civil War Reconstruction. And you'd have to go all the way back to Alexander the Great for one top-tier global power to have literally enacted regime change on its own in another top-tier global power in terms of Alexander and Persia. And that's what we have here. And Putin is trying to remake the world in his image because Trump is just like Yanukovych for him. And it's just like all these other corrupt leaders that he's trying to advance. The Le Pens in France, there's people in Austria that got caught red-handed on tape trying to exchange favors, the Five-Star Movement and the far-right league in Italy, you name it, all around the world, he's supporting these parties, these regimes, and they're gaining, and we're losing. The center is not holding. That's the book that was the title of the famous book about Obama winning in 2012, I believe. The center is not holding, and if people like us can't get our message out, and if the media doesn't focus on this and capture the big picture, I'm terrified for the future of Western democracy, not just the United States, because these threats are everywhere, and they're playing our own strengths against us in ways that we're still not realizing. And even now, the New York Times was back peddling, you mentioned earlier, the whole way that the Operation Infection started. Well, they got the Burisma stuff in the New York Times, and then all of a sudden, that's the main argument during the impeachment hearings against Donald Trump. The media is playing into Putin's and Trump's hands. They're constantly peddling disinformation planted by them and being a good fight.
Zarina, back to you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Luke, and thank you for also guiding the conversation. I think it's all being said. I just want to really thank Luke and everybody present for being here for an opinion. I know there are some other questions that are still unanswered, and some people did not introduce themselves right away, so I'll do a little follow-up. But I just want to say that what's important here that we don't only go towards the evidence road, there's also intelligence, and that's what books offer. Books give you this other dimension to information and give you a tool and a weapon in this information warfare that whether we want it or not, is happening. And so the bookstores and the books provide this space where we can learn to think critically. We don't have to all agree on something, but we can think and discuss. And for that, I just want to really thank everybody present, everybody watching us on YouTube, everybody who's going to watch this recording in the future. So let's think together and let's hope for the best. And thank you, Luke.